Delta Force, America's last line, was on its knees, trapped, surrounded, guns empty, radios screaming surrender, and then the desert shook. A shadow ripped across the sky. No warning, no radar, just fire raining down like judgment. Enemy armor turned to ash in seconds. But the pilot wasn't a general, not a legend. It was the woman they had erased, silenced and forgotten. Commander Aria Locke. They called her reckless. That night, she became unstoppable. This is A Simple Woman. Smash subscribe right now, because the story you're about to hear will show how one ghost in a bomber silenced the battlefield. Delta Force doesn't quit. That's what they tell themselves, what they bleed into recruits, what the world believes. But tonight, it broke. In a dust-choked valley surrounded on all sides, their rifles clicked empty. Magazines tossed aside, radios filled with static and desperation. We're out. God help us, we're out. Colonel Nathan Hale pressed his back to a shattered wall, sweat streaking through the grime on his face. He had fought in jungles, in deserts, in cities that no longer exist, but never had he said these words. He looked at his men, a dozen left, standing from a unit built to be unbreakable. He clenched his jaw, lifted his radio, and forced out the impossible. Delta Force is surrendering. The words didn't sound real, even as they cut through the comms. Soldiers hardened by years of fire lowered their heads. Some pulled strips of cloth from torn uniforms, tying them to rifle barrels. Others just sat down in the dirt, too exhausted to argue with fate. Above them, enemy mortars thumped, shells bursting closer, herding them like prey. The valley was death. There was no air cover left, no artillery, no hope. Hale had asked for extraction until his voice went hoarse. The response had been silence. The kind that means no one is coming. Sergeant Luke Rourke spat dust, slammed a fist into the ground. "This isn't us," he growled, but even he knew the truth. Their ammo was gone, their bodies torn, their fight bled out. For the first time in history, America's most feared warriors had raised their hands. And then the ground trembled. At first, they thought it was another shell. But the sound was different, low, steady, building like a storm beneath the earth. Men lifted their heads, squinting into smoke. Shadows stretched across the sky, too wide for a fighter jet, too silent for a drone. Something massive cut the moonlight, wings shaped like a predator out of nightmares. The enemy stopped firing. For a heartbeat, the battlefield froze. Searchlights swept the sky and found nothing. Radar screens lit up blank. Commanders barked confused orders. "Check the scope! Where is it?" And then fire fell. The valley lit in white fury as precision-guided bombs tore apart the ridges. Enemy mortars vanished in fountains of earth and flame. Anti-tank positions erupted. Men and metal tossed like leaves. The air itself seemed to split, the roar of explosions drowning out every thought. Delta Force soldiers ducked instinctively, then looked up with disbelief. It wasn't death that had found them. It was salvation. Rourke shouted into the comms, voice cracking with awe. "It's a bomber! Somebody's flying a damn stealth bomber!" Colonel Hale stared at the firestorms clawing the hillsides. He knew what had been said back at base. He knew who had been grounded, who had been forgotten. His lips parted as the truth sank in. Because this wasn't a ghost. It wasn't command swooping in with a miracle. It was her, Commander Aria Locke, the pilot they had erased, the woman they called reckless, the one the system buried, and now she was back. The bomber screamed overhead, invisible, untouchable, striking with surgical fury. Every blast ripped a hole in the enemy's grip. Every pass silenced another line of guns. The battlefield that had been hell seconds earlier was transformed, reshaped by one shadow in the sky. Delta Force hadn't been saved by a fleet, or by orders, or by the system. They were saved by the pilot no one wanted, a simple woman who refused to stay grounded. Before the valley turned into legend, before her name spread across radios, like wildfire, Aria Locke had been a ghost in her own service. Once, she had been the shining future of stealth aviation, the kind of pilot instructors couldn't stop talking about. Her evaluations read like prophecy, instinctive, precise, born for the cockpit. She moved through the controls of the B-2 Spirit, as if she had invented the machine. But brilliance in uniform always comes with shadows. For Aria, the shadow was her refusal to accept limits others worshipped. She didn't just follow flight manuals. She tore them apart, searching for the thin line between impossible and inevitable. That line was what cost her everything. It happened on a training mission over the Nevada desert. The scenario was rigged. Simulated anti-air batteries, radar nets, a gauntlet no crew had ever cleared. The point was to show futility, to remind even the best pilots that some walls can't be climbed. But Aria saw something no one else dared to attempt. On her HUD, where others saw walls of radar coverage, she saw seams, gaps where terrain bent the beams away. A canyon cut across the range like a hidden artery. If she flew low enough, recklessly low, she could vanish. Her CO pilot hesitated when she explained it. "That's suicide," he warned, his voice tight under the oxygen mask. Her reply was steady, stripped of drama. "It's simple. We go where they can't see." She pushed the bomber down. Warning alarms screamed. The altimeter spun into red. The Spirit's vast wings clipped shadows on both canyon walls as the ground blurred beneath them. To her, it wasn't chaos. It was math. Every movement measured, every correction exact. For 30 seconds, they disappeared from radar entirely. The towers scrambled, operators shouting into headsets. Then, like a phantom, she reappeared on the other side, perfectly aligned with the target. Simulated bombs dropped, and for the first time in the exercise's history, the scenario ended with a mission accomplished flashing across the screens. When they landed, mechanics cheered, pilots swarmed the jet, laughing and clapping her on the back. For one night, she was legend. By morning, she was finished. The Board of Inquiry assembled with General Whitaker at its head. His expression was carved from granite. He listened to the replay, to the arguments, to her quiet explanation. "Sir, it worked. The maneuver proves the aircraft can survive where no one expects." Whitaker's voice cut like a blade. "You gambled with a billion-dollar platform. You gambled with a crewman's life. You disobeyed orders. That's not strategy, Commander. That's recklessness." Her record was erased in a sentence. Effective immediately, you are grounded. After that, Aria became a ghost in plain sight. She was reassigned to logistics, stripped of her wings. In the hangars she once commanded, she now pushed paperwork. Younger pilots whispered when she passed, "That's her, the one who thought she knew better." Others laughed, not a commander anymore, just a simple woman pushing forms. She never fought the label, not out loud. She carried it in silence, walking the flight line alone at night, running. Her fingers across the cool fuselages of bombers she would never fly again. Inside, though, the fire never died. She knew the maneuver hadn't been madness. It had been vision. Every time she replayed the run in her head, she saw not recklessness, but clarity. The world called it dangerous because they couldn't see it. She had seen it. And one day, when war ripped through silence and soldiers begged for hope, that vision would be the only thing left standing. For now, she wore the exile, the insult, the invisibility. Aria Locke, grounded, forgotten, dismissed as reckless. Just a simple woman in the shadows. But legends often begin in the shadows. The call came in ragged bursts, more static than words, but enough to cut through every barrier Aria had built inside herself. She had been hunched over a stack of supply forms, the kind of busy work they gave her to keep her invisible when the radio on the wall sputtered. Delta, this is last ammo spent, surrounded, request any cover at all. The voice cracked, dissolved into static, then returned with a final shudder. We can't hold. Aria froze. She knew the tone. Men who never used the word surrender speaking as if it had already passed their lips. Delta Force wasn't supposed to sound like that. Her pen slipped from her hand, clattering onto the desk. She crossed the room in 3 strides, cranking the knob. Another voice bled through. This is Colonel Hale. I am ordering surrender. Repeat, Delta Force is surrendering. Then only white noise. Her stomach clenched. She saw the desert canyon in her mind, men cornered, weapons dry, waiting for death to close in. And she saw the hangar outside, where the forgotten B-2 Spirit sat covered in dust, its wide wings folded in silence. A machine no one believed mattered anymore, a pilot no one believed existed anymore. Aria turned on her heel and headed for operations. Inside, screens glowed red with failure. Commanders barked clipped orders, trying to manage chaos that had already spun past them. General Whitaker stood at the center, face stern, jaw locked. He looked up when Aria entered, as if seeing a ghost he had buried. "General," she said, voice steady, "let me take the Spirit. I can fly into the valley, break the encirclement, give Delta Force the air they need." Whitaker's expression hardened. "You're not authorized to speak, Commander. You're not authorized to fly. They're dying out there." Aria pressed, taking another step forward. "I know that terrain. I can run it low, below radar." "You know I can." The room fell silent. Everyone remembered the canyon run that had ended her career. Whitaker's eyes burned as he jabbed a finger toward her. "That stunt proved exactly why you're grounded. Reckless, disobedient. Do you think I'll risk the last stealth bomber we have on your ego?" "It's not ego," Aria shot back, voice like steel. "It's geometry, and right now, it's the only math that works." Whitaker's hand slammed the table. "Denied. Stand down. That is an order." For a heartbeat, the room was filled with nothing but the hum of electronics. Aria's fists clenched at her sides. On the radio, a faint echo broke through. Delta Force, casualties mounting. Anyone. The plea was weaker than before, fading like a candle. Aria looked straight at Whitaker. Her words were calm, final. "Then court-martial me after. But I won't sit here and let them die." She turned and walked out before he could stop her. Officers exchanged glances, but no one moved to block her path. Authority might write rules, but conviction commands silence. The hangar loomed like a cathedral of steel, its doors yawning open to the night. The B-2 Spirit rested inside, engines cold, fuselage dulled by dust. Forgotten by command, waiting for someone who still believed it mattered. Aria approached with purpose, her boots echoing against concrete. A young crew chief spotted her, confusion flashing across his face. "Commander, you can't look away!" She cut him off. "This isn't happening." For a long second he hesitated, then he stepped aside. Even he could see it in her eyes, the kind of certainty you don't argue with. Aria climbed the ladder, slid into the cockpit, and strapped in. Her hands moved by instinct, flipping switches, priming systems. The bomber hummed awake like a beast stirring from slumber. Panels lit green one by one. Engines whined, building into a low thunder. Outside, alarms blared. Command had realized what she was doing. Orders screamed through radios, "Stop that plane!" But the hangar doors were already rolling wide, and the Spirit's turbines howled with rising power. Aria pulled her visor down, eyes locked forward. They had called her reckless, erased her name, labeled her a simple woman. Maybe so. But simple didn't mean weak. Simple meant clear, direct, unstoppable. She eased the throttles forward. The bomber rolled out into the night, shadow swallowing shadow. Behind her, sirens wailed. Ahead, the battlefield waited. The Spirit rose. The runway blurred beneath her, lights streaking like comets as the Spirit gathered speed. Aria's hands were steady on the yoke, her breath calm, her focus razor-thin. With a final surge, the stealth bomber lifted free, wheels tucking away, wings stretching into the dark sky. The alarms from the base faded behind her. Ahead, the night opened like a battlefield waiting to be rewritten. She didn't climb. She couldn't. Instead, she dropped lower, hugging the earth as though it were a shield. The B-2 wasn't designed for this. An aircraft with wings that wide had no business flying so close to the ground. But Aria knew the truth. Radar eyes searched the skies, not the skin of the earth. Down here, she would vanish. The cockpit glowed with muted green light, her instruments painting a world invisible to anyone else. Radar sweeps passed overhead, beams searching and failing, their signals scattering against ridges. Enemy operators saw nothing but static. To them, the night was empty. In reality, a black predator was threading through their blind spots, every inch controlled by a pilot they had once discarded. Wind buffeted the bomber, jolts rattling its frame, but Aria read the turbulence like a second language. Adjust here, lean there, keep the altitude just above treetops. She had done this once in training, the maneuver that had ended her career. Tonight, it would save the men no one else could reach. Minutes stretched. Then the horizon began to glow. Smoke pillars clawed into the sky, backlit by burning wreckage. The closer she flew, the stronger the scent of war clung even through the sealed cockpit. Fuel, fire, and death carried on the air. Her throat tightened. The tactical display lit up red. Enemy armor clustered along ridge lines, artillery dug into slopes, searchlights stabbing across the valley, and at the center, Delta Force, survivors crouched in ruin, rifles laid aside, scraps of cloth tied to barrels, white flags, a sight Aria never thought she would see. Her headset crackled, a weak signal faint as a dying breath. "This is Colonel Hale. Delta Force has surrendered. Survivors awaiting capture." The last word fractured in static. Aria gritted her teeth. They had surrendered because Command let them. Because the Navy, the Air Force, the very system built to protect them had turned away. And now, the only thing standing between them and annihilation was her. She pulled the bomber lower, engines whispering instead of roaring, a shadow gliding inches above the earth. Enemy radar swept again and again, but her silhouette blended with hills and smoke. Searchlights cut the sky, but never touched her wings. To the men below, the night remained empty. Her eyes narrowed on the valley. She saw the enemy massing, rifles raised, mortars adjusting, preparing to take prisoners or slaughter them. Delta Force knelt in the dirt, shoulders slumped, faces hardened in bitter shame. They had been trained never to quit. And yet here they were, hands raised to a merciless sky. Aria exhaled, steady and slow. This was the moment. The reason she had stolen this flight, the reason she had ignored every order. Her hand slid to the weapons panel. Green lights blinked, payload armed. The Spirit carried fire enough to shatter the valley in one strike. But it wasn't just bombs she carried. It was the truth they had buried. The truth that one so-called reckless pilot had always known. She tightened her grip on the controls. The bomber's nose dipped toward the battlefield, black wings slicing silently through smoke. Delta Force thought they were finished. The enemy thought victory was certain. Both were wrong. Because tonight a ghost had taken flight, and the battlefield was about to learn what a simple woman could do. The valley erupted in fire. Aria Locke pressed the release, and the B-2 Spirit obeyed with a shudder, its belly opening to spill precision-guided fury into the night. For a heartbeat, the bombs disappeared into blackness. Then the ridges exploded. Entire mortar lines disintegrated in fountains of rock and fire there, thunder rolling across the canyon like the sky had split in two. Delta Force soldiers flinched, covering their heads, then slowly lifted their eyes. Where enemy positions had been seconds earlier, there was nothing but flame. Sergeant Luke Rourke blinked through the haze, disbelief on his face. That's us. She's hitting for us. Enemy commanders shouted into radios, frantic. No contact on radar. Where is it coming from? Searchlights whipped across the sky but found only smoke. Aria's bomber was invisible, a phantom gliding above the chaos. She lined up the next strike, eyes locked on the tactical display. Tanks clustered near the valley mouth, barrels aimed at the broken American perimeter. She whispered, "Not tonight," and toggled another release. Guided munitions dropped silent and precise. The tanks erupted one by one, turrets blown skyward, steel raining down like shrapnel meteors. Survivors scattered, their will to fight collapsing in firelight. Delta Force radios came alive again, no longer with surrender but with disbelief and hope. "She's clearing them out! We've got cover!" Colonel Hale, still kneeling when the first bombs fell, pushed himself upright, grit smeared across his face. His voice cracked but carried, "Pick your rifles back up. We're not done." Above, Aria kept the bomber low and steady, carving paths of fire with every pass. Artillery bunkers collapsed under pinpoint detonations. Rocket crews vanished in blossoms of dust. Machine gun nests silenced in seconds. The battlefield transformed, the noose around Delta Force shredded into fragments. For the men on the ground, it was like watching the hand of judgment sweep the ridges clean. Every explosion wasn't just destruction, it was permission to live. Soldiers who had tied white cloths to their rifles tore them off, fists clenching around weapons once more. They had been moments from captivity, shame burning deeper than wounds. Now, with every blast, they felt the weight lift. Rourke shouted above the roar, "It's her! It has to be her!" The name wasn't spoken, but every man knew. The woman they'd heard whispers about, the pilot buried by her own command. A simple woman who had refused to stay silent. Enemy fire faltered. Their mortars gone, their tanks wrecked, the ridges collapsed into chaos. Men screamed orders that no one followed. Panic spread faster than shrapnel. "It's a ghost!" one voice cried over enemy comms. "A bomber from nowhere," and the rumor stuck. Fear gripped them harder than steel. Aria's fuel gauge dipped lower, her payload dwindled. But it was enough. She had done what no doctrine could have scripted. She had turned surrender into resistance. The Spirit's final run tore through the last battery of heavy guns, clearing a path wide enough for Delta Force to break free. On the ground, Hale seized the moment. "Move! Move! Now!" His men surged forward, charging through smoke and rubble toward the gap she had carved. Where once there had been a wall of fire, there was now an open corridor, lit by the wreckage of enemy guns. Aria pulled the bomber back into a climb, engines whispering as she passed silently overhead. She looked down through the haze. Men who had laid down arms were running again, rifles raised, eyes blazing with life. She exhaled, the tightness in her chest easing for the first time. The battlefield had been lost. Delta Force had given up, but in the space of minutes, one forgotten pilot had turned despair into defiance. The valley was hers now, not through orders, not through medals, but through fire. The battlefield lay smouldering, the ridges carved open, the night air thick with smoke. Where minutes ago the enemy had pressed forward with confidence, now they stumbled in chaos. Officers screamed into radios, their voices cracking with disbelief. "Check the radar again!" one shouted, but the screens were empty. No signals, no tracks, nothing to explain why their artillery had vanished in fire. Among the enemy infantry, fear spread faster than orders. Some swore they had seen wings cut across the moonlight, too broad, too silent to be real. Others swore there had been nothing at all, only fire dropping from an invisible hand. "It's not a plane!" one soldier gasped, eyes wide as he stumbled backward through rubble. "It's a ghost! A bomber with no shadow!" The phrase passed from foxhole to foxhole until it became a chorus. The ghost bomber. Commanders tried to rally their men, but discipline cracked under the weight of superstition. Searchlights swept frantically, illuminating only smoke and broken stone. Anti-air gunners fired blind into the night, tracers arcing uselessly across the sky. Every round wasted only deepened the panic. If you cannot see what hunts you, how do you fight? For Delta Force, the shift was just as profound. Only moments earlier, white flags had been tied to rifles, shame heavier than their wounds. Now those same men stood with weapons in hand, staring skyward as the echoes of the bombardment faded. The silence was surreal, broken only by ragged breathing. Sergeant Rourke wiped ash from his face, whispering like he couldn't trust his own voice. That wasn't command. That was her. Colonel Hale, still gripping his radio, felt the weight of the truth settle. He had given the order to surrender, a choice that carved shame into his bones. And yet, against every chain of command, someone had heard them. Someone had answered. He looked at his men, eyes wide, postures shifting from despair to awe, and gave the only explanation that fit. "A pilot," he said softly. "A woman they silenced." The whispers grew. Soldiers traded fragments of rumor they'd heard around bases, stories dismissed as gossip, about a test pilot who flew too low, about a maneuver no one else could dare, about a commander erased from the roster called reckless, branded useless, a simple woman. That was what the system had named her. But here, in the valley drenched with fire, that phrase carried new weight. One by one, voices repeated it, at first in disbelief. "A simple woman did this?" Then in reverence, "A simple woman saved us." By the time the unit regrouped, the words had become something else entirely, an identity, a legend rising from smoke. The enemy, too, spread their own version. On intercepted frequencies, Aria's attack mutated into myth. Crews swore the bomber hadn't come from any base, that it rose straight out of the ashes of the battle, born from wreckage and flame. Others insisted no human could have flown so low, struck so clean. "It wasn't a pilot," one terrified voice insisted. "It was judgment." But among the men of Delta Force, there was no such doubt. They had heard her voice, calm, stripped of rank, steady as stone. Just 3 words through static. "You're not alone." That voice was not judgment. It was salvation. As dawn crept pale across the horizon, Delta Force staggered out of the valley, boots crunching over rubble. They carried their wounded, weapons in hand once more, their formation ragged but alive. And on every lip, a phrase carried between them like a torch: she was just a simple woman. For the enemy, it was a ghost bomber. For the men she saved, it was something far greater. Not a ghost, not a myth, a woman, real, alive, unstoppable. And though they didn't know her name, they knew the truth. The battlefield had been silenced. Not by armies, not by generals, but by one pilot the world had tried to erase. The stealth bomber limped across the dawn sky, a jagged shadow against the pale horizon. Its fuselage was scarred with shrapnel, panels scorched from near misses, paint peeled in long streaks by the heat of its own fury. Inside the cockpit, Aria Locke kept her hands steady, though her arms ached and her eyes burned from hours of focus. The gauges warned of low fuel. The hydraulics whined in protest, but she coaxed the Spirit forward until the runway lights shimmered beneath her. Engines coughed as the aircraft touched down, tires shrieking against asphalt. The massive bomber rolled heavy down the strip before settling, groaning like a beast wounded but unbroken. When it came to a halt, silence swept the tarmac. Crews who had gathered out of duty now stood frozen, their eyes locked on the impossible sight. The bomber had flown. It had returned. And the pilot climbing down its ladder was the woman Command had sworn would never touch a cockpit again. Aria's boot struck the ground, her flight suit still streaked with soot and dust. She pulled off her helmet, sweat matted in her hair, but her expression was calm, her stride measured. The aircrew parted as she walked past, none daring to speak. A few saluted quietly, unbidden, as though instinct recognized what Command had denied. Inside headquarters, tension simmered like a storm. General Whitaker waited at the head of a long table, jaw clenched so tight the vein at his temple pulsed. Colonel Nathan Hale stood nearby, bandaged and battered, the lines of fatigue etched deep into his face. He had been flown in with the survivors, his men alive only because of her. The contrast between him and Whitaker was stark, one gaunt with guilt and awe, the other rigid with pride and fury. The doors opened. Aria entered without hesitation, helmet tucked beneath her arm. She didn't salute. She didn't ask permission. She stood at the center of the room, her presence louder than any words. Whitaker broke first, his voice sharp. You disobeyed a direct order. You stole government property. You endangered an entire operation. His hand struck the table with each accusation. Do you have any idea what this means for your career, for this command? Colonel Hale turned, his voice low but heavy. It means my men are alive. It means we walked out of a valley where we'd already surrendered. And we did because of her. He gestured toward Aria, his bandaged hand trembling with conviction. Call it theft. Call it insubordination. Call it whatever you want. General, but don't forget to call it what it truly was, salvation. The room fell quiet. Officers along the wall shifted, torn between regulation and reality. Aria's eyes never left Whitaker's. She spoke then, her voice calm, measured. You grounded me because you said I was reckless, because I saw paths no one else dared to take. Tonight, those paths kept Delta Force from being wiped out. She set the helmet on the table, its visor cracked, its paint scorched. You don't have to like what I did, but you can't erase what it meant. Whitaker's mouth tightened, words caught in his throat. He wanted to condemn her, to bury her again beneath rules and reprimands. But the weight of Hale's gaze, the whispers of officers, the undeniable truth of survivors breathing outside these walls, all of it pressed against him. Admiral Mercer, pale and silent until now, finally spoke. "General, I lost ships, I lost sailors, but what I didn't lose was my faith that somewhere in this military there's still someone willing to do what must be done." She proved that. His voice, hoarse with exhaustion, carried finality. "We can't bury her anymore. We can only admit we were wrong." Whitaker's shoulders stiffened. He looked at Aria, fury and resignation warring in his eyes. At last he said nothing. Silence was his only surrender. Aria nodded once, then turned for the door. She didn't need medals, apologies, or permission. Behind her, Colonel Hale's voice filled the room, gravel and conviction interwoven. Delta Force gave up until she silenced the battlefield. Remember that, gentlemen. The door shut, and in the quiet that followed, even Whitaker knew the truth. A legend had just walked out, and no regulation could hold her anymore. The parade ground was dressed for spectacle. Flags lined the perimeter, brass polished to blinding shine, rows of uniforms pressed into stiff perfection. At the center stood a podium draped in blue, and on it a velvet case, the Navy Cross, a medal meant for legends. Cameras crowded the edges, waiting to capture the redemption of Commander Aria Locke. General Whitaker stood ready to present it, his jaw locked in that same iron line, while Colonel Hale lingered off to the side, arms crossed, the faintest trace of defiance still on his face. Admiral Mercer's presence carried the weight of survival. He had insisted this ceremony take place, not because Aria wanted it, but because the men who owed her their lives demanded it. When her name was called, silence fell. Aria walked forward slowly, her boots echoing on concrete. She wore her flight suit, still scarred from fire and smoke, the patch half burned from her shoulder. She had refused the dress uniform, refused the polish. What the world saw was not a hero adorned, but the same woman who had flown into fire when everyone else had abandoned hope. Whitaker cleared his throat, his voice formal, rehearsed. "For extraordinary courage under fire, for saving America's finest when the battle was lost, the United States awards." Aria raised a hand. The gesture stopped him cold. Murmurs rippled through the ranks. She turned toward the assembled crowd, her expression calm, her voice steady. "I can't take this." Gasps rolled across the formation. Whitaker's eyes narrowed. "This is not optional, Commander." "Yes, it is," she replied. She let the silence linger, then spoke with a clarity that carried to the farthest rows. "I didn't fly that night for medals. I didn't fly for redemption. I flew because Delta Force called for help and no one else answered. Because men who never surrender were being forced to. That was enough." She turned her gaze to the survivors in the front row, bandaged and bruised but alive. "If you lived, it wasn't because I'm special. It's because you kept fighting until someone heard you. I was just the one who chose to listen." Hale's jaw tightened, his eyes glistening, but he didn't look away. Aria stepped back from the podium, her words landing heavier than any medal could. "I'm no one special," she said softly, "just a simple woman who did what had to be done." For a long moment the crowd was silent. Then Sergeant Rourke, his arm still in a sling, raised his good hand in salute. "Ma'am," he said, his voice raw, "that's what makes you more than special." Others followed. First the Delta survivors, then sailors, then soldiers, a ripple of salutes spreading across the ground. Whitaker lowered the medal back into its case, his face unreadable. Mercer closed his eyes briefly, as if sealing the truth into memory. Hale spoke aloud what everyone else had begun to whisper. The battlefield was lost until a simple woman silenced it. No cameras captured the moment Aria turned away, walking back down the aisle with her head high, leaving the medal untouched. But every soldier there carried it in memory. They didn't see her as a decorated officer. They saw her as what she had declared, a simple woman who refused to let them die. And that truth spread faster than any official record. Among allies, she became the quiet legend who broke surrender with fire. Among enemies, the ghost bomber who came from nowhere and vanished just as quickly. But in the end, her name didn't matter. What mattered was the lesson carved into the battlefield that night, that sometimes the strength to change history comes not from ranks or medals or orders, but from one person willing to stand when everyone else falls. She was not a hero in her own eyes, not a savior, not a ghost, just a simple woman. And that was enough to silence the battlefield. And that's how the battlefield fell silent, not by an army, not by a fleet, but by one woman the world had written off. She never asked for medals, never claimed glory. She just refused to let surrender be the final word. If this story moved you, hit subscribe and join us here on A Simple Woman, where the untold battles of ordinary people are finally given a voice. Drop a comment below. Do you believe one ordinary person can change the fate of many? We read every single one, and your voice keeps this community alive. Like, share, and stay tuned, because the next story will show once again how simplicity can hold unstoppable strength. This is A Simple Woman.